Hello. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I have to speak in English, but my mother tongue is Portuguese. I'm originally from Brazil, and there we say bom dia. Good morning. I was born in Brazil, and I moved to Costa Rica after spending some time in Europe 30 years ago, actually. So I have been there for 30 years. And my intention today is to share with you a little bit about our work and my own thinking behind the lenses of the Earth Charter and sustainability and ESD. But what brings us together here today is also to think about education. So what is really the purpose of education? What was the purpose of education for Korea, for Malaysia, for Brazil 100 years ago? What was the purpose of education 50 years ago? And what is really the purpose of education for the current times? So I would invite you to think that, well, there are many purposes, but at the core of the purpose is, of course, self-development of the individual, right? 100 years ago, not so many people had access to reading and writing, even universities. My grandparents never had the possibility to access higher education. Actually, not even secondary education, because it was hard in Brazil. 80 years ago, 60 years ago, less people had access to secondary education and to higher education. The world is different now, even though there are many people still that do not have access to basic education or to higher education. The percentage of people in the world nowadays that have access to general education is much higher. So we have to celebrate that, right? So maybe the purpose of education at the current times could also be to enhance the capacity of people to contribute to the common good. However, when we go to education, or when we want our children to go through an education process, higher education, etc., we are probably not thinking, I want my children, or I want myself to have the skills and knowledge to contribute to the betterment of society, or I want my children to go there so that my children or myself will have better access to material wealth. So there is a narrative, probably a predominant narrative in the world, that makes us think that access to education is for this individual self. And this predominant narrative is something that we may want to question. So let's talk a little bit about, let me present a little bit about where we are and what I do, and then I go into talking a bit about sustainability. So this is more or less where I spend every day. We have an education center that when I walked around here today, I could really relate to this beautiful center in Tonyang, RCE. Because 15 years ago, I had a similar dream. You need a dream and vision, leadership, collaboration to make this happen, right? Probably 15, 20 years ago, nothing existed here. It required someone to have a dream, a vision, and then call on others and have a discussion to have a shared dream to build this place. So I really want to pay tribute to the leadership and collective leadership, I would say, of many people who were involved to make this place happen. It requires courage and vision. So we had a similar vision. We have built a smaller center, but it's located in Costa Rica, and it's focused on this. We established a UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development. And so what is that? That means that the work we do focus on the intersection between these three dimensions, right? The intersection that brings the notion of sustainability but looking at it through the lenses of values and ethics, the underlying values and ethics of sustainability, and how to bring that to education in a transformative manner. So much of our work of this UNESCO chair that we established over 10 years ago focuses on the intersection of these three dimensions that you see there. And with that, we do a lot of work with research and training. In 2003, UNESCO adopted the first resolutions, the first resolution out of two, that recognizes the Earth Charter as an important instrument, as an important ethical framework for sustainable development. And in 2019, they adopted a second resolution. It's a UNESCO resolution that recognizes the Earth Charter as an important ethical framework and an educational instrument, and encourages member states to use the Earth Charter as an instrument. So basically, these are two UNESCO resolutions that make calls upon not only member states, but all those involved with ESD to use the Earth Charter as an instrument, and we basically help UNESCO to implement that. But at the core of it involves this idea of inviting all of us to think about what is the ripple effect that we are generating in our path here. Are we thinking about the consequences and the impact of our acts? Are we fostering consciousness in children and the learner in general to think about the footprints? What are the footprints we are leaving on our path here? Can we be more intentional in consistent, intentional, conscious for leaving more positive footprints through our decisions and actions in our path here through the world? So, and we see education as a very important tool for that, certainly. So just last week, there was a global education meeting that took place in Brazil, similar to the Incheon Forum that took place here in 2015. So it was a very important education forum that UNESCO organized in 2015. I actually make use a lot of the Incheon Declaration and the Plan of Action. That is much deeper and broader than what happened last week in Brazil. And I want maybe just to pause here to make a reflection about that. So UNESCO organized two forums before Incheon, as far as I can remember. One was in Dakar, and the other one was in Jutian. So they call the Dakar Agenda or the Jutian Agenda. And these two agendas were really focused on education for all. Education for all as the driving force for international cooperation around education, right? This was the biggest agenda in those days. But when Incheon happened in 2015, the shift was not limited to education for all, but on quality education and on the SDG 4.7. So here is something for us to think about, how the Incheon meeting made a big shift to expand that the thinking or the driver for international cooperation around education is not just to ensure more education, but what kind of education, the quality of education. You see, there's a big shift there in looking at the role of SDG 4.7, specifically on ESD and global citizenship ed. So there was a movement to expand on that. And last week in Brazil, UNESCO just hosted the new global education meeting. And I would say that the focus now is really to ensure significant financing for quality education is the driver. Of course, reinforcing or building the Incheon Declaration and so forth, but UNESCO is really concerned that many countries are not dedicating enough percentage of the national budget to education. Actually, many countries have attention to shrink that. So a lot of this effort is to ensure that countries don't go below 6 to 8% of the GDP that is dedicated to education. So let's see just a few things that we could extract from what happened in terms of government decisions last week. There was a commitment to pursue a holistic and lifelong approach to education. So again, stressing the importance of the lifelong learning, which is beyond. So we could have a whole conversation about what lifelong learning means, but the idea is that it is not just fixed on what happens inside the formal education system or what we understand for formal education system in primary school, secondary school, and higher education, but could be non-formal education, professional development, etc. So last week, governments basically reiterate their commitment to the importance of holistic and lifelong approach to education with a focus on the system strengthening and transformation. So there is a lot of language around transforming the education systems across the world. How education is not just vertical or not just to get through the point you pass an exam and then you forget about things, but how to transform and make education really be a driver for instance, the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. They also highlighted the importance of ESD and the need to focus on the system's capacity, so the capacity on system capacity development and continuous professional development of teachers. And why? So this is basically what I'm extracting from the document that was just approved last week, because it reiterates government's commitment to ESD, but it also recognizes the importance to ensure systems capacity to implement the policies, right, around ESD, but also on professional development for teachers. Because one thing is to have an international policy, an agenda on ESD. Another thing is what does it mean to the classroom? What does it mean to the teachers, to the mathematics or language teacher or science or history, social studies? Like how can they connect social studies, math, or even if they are in higher education, if someone is studying to be a lawyer or having an MBA or in engineering, how to connect that. This requires really ensuring the professional development and some changes in the capacity of the whole education system to infuse that. The same document also reiterates the importance to integrate education for peace, human rights, in democratic citizenship and sustainable development in school curriculum. So this is something that is happening for the past 20 years. But more and more, that this kind of decisions governments are reiterating through this. So my question here to reflect with you is, what could be the major challenges to actually make it happen? Because these decisions are coming and going through different UN and UNESCO documents to infuse, incorporate sustainability into education. So I invite you to think that one of them is our own mindsets, worldviews, because the way in which we organize our thinking, the way in which we are taught, the way in which our organizations are organized are fragmented. But here, sustainability requires us to think through the lens of system thinking or in a holistic manner. So one of the major challenges is really to recognize that we need ongoing, consistent work to expand and change our worldviews. So sustainability really requires that. Meaning that we need an ongoing, consistent effort to move from a fragmented approach to an integrated approach. From an anthropocentric approach to a life-centric or an ecocentric approach. What does it mean? So I would say the advanced level of understanding sustainability is that we need to take care of nature or the planet, not just because it's good for the human beings, but because it's a moral, ethical responsibility with the community of life. There's a different perspective here. It's not for utilitarian. So I take care of forests, of a river, not just because it's common sense for human beings, because human beings need clean water and the forests. It's because we have an ethical responsibility with the large living world that is beyond humans. So there's a different perspective here on fostering a worldview that is not limited to an anthropocentric worldview of the world that places the human at top, but fostering a worldview that is more life-centric or ecocentric. So that's a huge challenge. And maybe one challenge is also on a vacuum or maybe even a crisis of values and ethics of our current societies that is making us sometimes not live in a coherent manner. Okay, so many of you who are in the room, of course, know about sustainability. So I just want to illustrate what do I mean by worldviews. A lot of our decisions and the way we see the world is in this fragmented manner, right? Economy is there. Let's look at the well-being of people. Oh no, let's take care of nature. So people put environmental issues in a corner and the well-being of people in another corner, budget-wise, decision-making-wise, and etc. However, when we go to the supermarket or when an institution is going to make a decision, the worldview is a lot like this. Some people call it the Mickey Mouse worldview because it looks like Mickey Mouse, right? The worldview is driven by the financial consequences or the financial interest of a decision, even when we go to a supermarket and also when we make bigger decisions regarding an institution, for instance. So we're not seeing the connection between them. And the challenge, the major challenge of sustainability requires us to start looking at the interrelations of things. So at the core, for us to understand and have the skills to look at things through the lenses of sustainability involves us to shift from these two into something that is more, okay, what are the relationships between these various dimensions? With this lens or this approach, we would look at sustainability more, okay, the well-being of the economic system is a subset or subsystem of the social life. So the well-being of, we need to ensure a healthy environment and a healthy human being, society, in order to ensure a healthy economy. But economic approach shouldn't be the main driver. The main driver should be the well-being of people and life on the planet. So a lot of all of this has to do with, are we aware with the lenses through which we see the world and through which we make decisions? This involves thinking about our mindsets, our perspectives, our worldview, with a constant effort to look at things through an integrated manner. So when the ESD idea emerged, there was a little fight with environment educators because, again, sometimes we change a term in order to expand what we are trying to look at, right? For in the minds of many people in different parts of the world, environment education is focused on conservation and caring for the environment. But when the ESD terminology and approach came, was kind of, let's expand that to ensure the linkages, again, the linkages between the human well-being and nature. Okay, so much of the work we do involves fostering a planetary worldview, a planetary consciousness that is centered in life. expanding our capacity to see the connections, not only between the social, environment, and economic dimension, but also expanding our capacity to see our place in the world, in this large living world, not only among humans, but also as part of nature, as part of the community of life. So I believe many of you might have seen this image, but it's basically an image that helps us to visualize what we mean by an anthropocentric worldview, or a worldview that is centered on the human being at the top, versus a worldview that puts the human being as part of this community of life. So what do you think would change in the way in which we see the world and in the way in which we would make our decisions if we move from a limited and anthropocentric worldview to a worldview that is a more ecocentric? Can you picture yourself? Can you envision yourself walking through your day-to-day life with this view? Can you picture yourself walking through your everyday life, making your decisions with this view? Can you just imagine what would change? A more caring, a more mindful way of going through life, seeing the others, not just the human being at the top. And therefore, with this shifting worldview, the idea is that it will be reflected in policies, in decision-making, from an individual to institutional level. Okay, so just to conclude here on this section around the key challenges that I see and that I invite you to see, and I think these are challenges that education processes and even education system need to be mindful in seeing how can we address these challenges. So the first one, and actually the second and the third, involves this idea of expanding our views, kind of recalibrating the way we see the world, we see life, the interconnections, not in a fragmented manner, but looking at the connections and how we are connected with this large living world. So the challenge is how education can really be more intentional in playing a role in addressing this challenge of expanding our eyesight, our worldviews, to see the connections and relationship. But also the challenge of clarifying our values. And what do I mean by that? So for instance, rather than the driving force for me to go through education is for me to have a better car or a better house, or the driving force for me, my kids, and the whole education system to go through education is to be a better human being. And a better human being means maybe a more caring, responsible, kind, empathetic, compassionate human being. So is our education system cultivating those kind of values and worldviews through the education system? I wonder, because having a PhD, I mean, very successful, going through all these different letters, no? PhD in law or in business or economy, doesn't necessarily make us a better human being. In fact, I don't know if you know, but I know several people who have a lot of certificates, PhDs, experts, that doesn't make them necessarily a better human being. Isn't that so? So for instance, I come from Brazil, and every year we have disasters. Disasters that, especially this year and the last couple of years, that some people say is climate change driven. But it's actually disasters that engineers foresaw. They saw the problem coming, like a bridge falling apart, or a flood coming and killing a lot of people, right? So there are a lot of engineers or business people, managers with a lot of studies in education making those decisions. But that's the question. Why so many social injustices and environmental degradation is continuously happening? Why? Why? Because we're training people to see the world in a fragmented manner and not necessarily to be a more caring, responsible human being. So they make decisions in a short manner, short-term eyesight, not through the lens of ethics. So we have a lot of highly literate people, but ethically and systemically illiterate. So here's a challenge, is to address how we can become better human beings through the education systems. But this requires a lot of collaboration. And I think with the whole UN, UNESCO agenda around ESD and global citizenship ed, is an opportunity, it gives us an opportunity to make these changes if we're able to collaborate across sectors. So I suppose all of you know the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. We have a few years to go. And UNESCO has been placing the SDG 4 at the center to make as a driver for all the other SDGs. But to make it happen, we have to ask ourselves really what needs to be done. And I think that SDG 4.7 is a key to make the whole wheel really spin. So this we're going to look at their chart, I think, more now. So let me just go, before that I go through very quickly through key UNESCO education agendas. So this one you may know, or some of you know, came from the Incheon Declaration that happened here in 2015. In May 2015, there was this huge education forum that developed this education framework for action, which is crucial, is essential still nowadays on how to implement the SDG 4, and there's a lot of things around SDG 4.7. And then at the end of the UN Decade on Education for Sustainable Development, UNESCO worked on the ESD for 2030, is another agenda, right, of UNESCO. And then 4 years went on in this process, which is called the Reimagining Education, or the Futures of Education. It's called the Reimagining the Futures of Education. It's a whole agenda inside the UNESCO on that is not necessarily connected to this, explicitly connected, because the people who are behind the ESD agenda are those who are behind the Sustainable Development Agenda. And those inside the UNESCO and even in ministries of education that are behind these are in general involved in education, in general, in more funding for education. Okay, two more key UNESCO education agendas. One is the Greening Education Partnership that UNESCO has been promoting significantly in the last 2 years. And this one involves the global citizenship education. I'm just sharing with you some of the key UNESCO agendas or policies around education and under the framework of international cooperation that are, to a certain extent, being seen in a fragmented way. So here's one thing that I think that is common to across these different agendas. All of these agendas, they call for a kind of education that empowers the learners with what? With what? With the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to take informed decisions and make responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability in society. So this is a very, even though these agendas are promoted in a fragmented way inside the UNESCO system, interesting enough that there is some commonalities that they're all referring to we need to foster a kind of knowledge, skills, and values that help, that enhance the capacity of the learner to contribute to the betterment of society. The question is, what are these knowledge, skills, and values inside these different agendas, right? So there is another instrument that was launched last year. I was very honored to be part of the process. That's called the New Recommendation on Education for Peace, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development. Basically, this was a recommendation that was put together in 1974 by the UN, by UNESCO, and they took that recommendation and did a new, resuscitated and revised it and launched it. And we can see the agenda, the ESD agenda, the peace education agenda, all inside this one, right? This instrument. But UNESCO did that because this is a special instrument for monitoring and evaluation of the SDG 4.7 through the governments, right? And by the way, there is this other one here I forgot to mention, which is involves the climate change. So inside the UN Climate Change Convention, there is Article 6 of Climate Change Convention and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. They refer to the importance of climate change education. So imagine the life of a teacher that is in a classroom, in a school, trying to figure out what to do with all these agendas. It can be very complicated. So we have been looking at this, and now this new one too. So I put the word here, alignment. We need to find ways to align these different efforts to make the life easier of a teacher or a school or a university to incorporate these various agendas in their day-to-day work. So here, to help facilitate what does it mean in that, what are the knowledges, values, and skills that we could envision, at least through the framework of ESD. So for instance, what are the knowledge that we want to foster, right? In the lens of ESD, as minimum could be limits of that understanding that our planet have limits, Earth carrying capacity or the regenerative capacity of Earth. For learners to understand the intersection or interlinkages of environment and social injustices. For instance, the notion of Earth community, which we could link with global citizenship education very strongly. Skills, all these or most of these UNESCO education agendas are referring to or emphasizing the importance to foster critical thinking, system thinking, future vision, creativity, etc. Especially in the ESD agenda, key skills to be fostered from primary school to higher education is critical thinking, system thinking, and the capacity to envision the future in a different way. So the future vision involves envisioning a different future so that we can work towards that rather than just staying with the current conditions humanity have. Some of these are similar across global citizenship education and ESD. But I see really ESD as a framework, or let's say as an umbrella, that we could say, I'm doing ESD in my school, I'm implementing ESD, and through that, I'm also implementing global citizenship education. In my university, we are implementing ESD, and through that, we are also implementing climate change education, global citizenship education, and etc. It can be done if we are able to make bridges, the linkages, or align them. Now, in those UNESCO education documents, we often see the need to foster values. But then the question here is, what are the values we need to foster, right? And I would invite you to think, okay, the values of care, respect, responsibility, solidarity, for instance, they cut across ESD, global citizenship ed, climate change education, and etc. So the effort, I think, for the schools and the educators is to to look at the linkages of these terminologies or UNESCO policies and bring it to the classroom in an integrated manner. Okay, so here's a quick exercise I did just to share with you. When we look at the whole world, again, promoting ESD, another one on GCED, Global Citizenship Ed, or environment education, trying to find synergies between them. So my invitation for you is to think that all of them require, or talking about the need to expand the learner's planetary consciousness. If I'm doing this, or that, I'm expanding our global perspective. We are also fostering values of respect, care, responsibility. For instance, learning to live together, learning to be more empathetic, kind, helping the learner to have more concern for the well-being of present and future generations. But if we look at the specific areas in each one of them, so for instance, environment education, maybe we could say has a stronger focus on earth carrying capacity, a stronger focus on human-nature relationship, fostering better human-nature relationship, or ecological literacy. And maybe global citizenship education, in addition to all of this, has a stronger focus on the human-to-human nature, relations across cultures, this intercultural understanding. And ESD probably has a very strong focus on bringing all of this together, I would say. And the interconnections, a systemic approach, this notion of responsibility, it really invites us to exercise this short-term and long-term approach of decision, of the impact of our lives and decisions, short-term and long-term approach. Very strong in the idea of sustainability. Okay, now coming from a developing country, and I know how strong and how difficult it is in Latin America. There's a lot of people working in the ministries of education that say ESD, global citizenship education, is a luxury. We need to focus on quality education. So our question here is, isn't ESD and global citizenship ed actually contributing to the quality of education through the lens of a pedagogical approach of ESD? And I would strongly say yes. And therefore, it shouldn't be a tension between putting a focus on quality education versus a focus on ESD. We should figure out a way to look at this together. Okay, here are three things that I again see as very common in these different approaches to education, global citizenship ed, ESD, or even environment ed, is that all of them are strengthening, but I would say again that ESD is very strong in system thinking. Both of them, all of them are calling for new approaches to the how, or the pedagogical approach, and in fostering a certain values. Let me just move on here. So I'm sharing all of this because I really think the current education system is not necessarily helping, or is not necessarily serving as a driver for sustainability. But on the contrary, the current education system may be taking societies to the paradigm of unsustainability. But in certain cases, I would say exceptional cases, it could be cultivating a culture of care and respect for the large living world. And I think that's where we should be heading, fostering, making sure that the education system, education experiences, efforts cultivate this new ethic of care in large living world. So I end at least this part here with what is the cost of an ecological and ethical illiteracy? So can you think about that for your country, your community? What is the cost of someone who has gone through an formal education system, but has a vacuum of an ethical literacy, has a vacuum on ecological literacy. So that means it's someone who has taken a high position in a company or in a country because they have the knowledge on something, but without ethics and without an ecological literacy, this may generate something that it's not necessarily good for society. So here I come to share with you a little bit about what is the Earth Charter. So the Earth Charter is a framework. Let me just invite you to think that it's an ethical framework. The Earth Charter is an ethical compass. What's the purpose of a compass? When we are lost in the middle of the ocean, when we are lost in the middle of the forest, a compass is very handy. It's very useful because it helps us to have an idea of where we are and which direction we should go. So an ethical compass is like having this in the pocket, and when we need to make a decision, we take a look and say, okay, the decision that I'm about to make will have these or that consequences, and think about that through the ethical lenses of the common good. So the Earth Charter can serve, it serves, has been serving as an ethical framework, a compass, as an ethical reference, like a lighthouse, or an ethical foundation for decisions and etc. But can also serve as an educational instrument to foster dialogue or to clarify values of sustainability, to clarify values of global citizenship. The Earth Charter is organized in 4 parts. At the center of it is the pillar. At the heart of it is an ethic of respect and care for the community of life. Why the word community of life? Is again an invitation for us to think that we humans, we are not the only ones here. We belong to a community of life. And our lens, our understanding of an ethical life involves caring and respect not only among humans of all cultures or different cultures, but also of this large living world that is called here community of life. Again, just with the words, it's an invitation for us to expand this narrative that values, ethics, respect, responsibility goes beyond the human to human borders. It has a pillar on ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. But the most important in all of this is that it's an instrument, again, an ethical framework, an ethical compass, an instrument that helps us to see the relationship of all these dimensions through our decisions. The Earth Charter involves a document, as I just mentioned, the document that has this organized in 4 parts. Involves a document, but it involves also, actually, by the way, let me just go back here. Many of you have heard of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, right? So the Human Rights Declaration is focused on human rights and the rights of the individual to do things, or the limits of the rights. The comparison here is that I invite you to look at it through this lens, that the Earth Charter is an instrument focused on responsibilities, fostering not only my rights, but what are my responsibilities with the common good, through the lenses of interdependence. So it's a declaration of not human rights, it's a declaration of responsibilities and interdependence. So it is a document, it's a global movement that involves schools, universities, NGOs, some local governments, national governments that embrace the Earth Charter as an ethical reference, just as UNESCO has adopted it. But it's also an institution, the Education Center, that is located in Costa Rica. And we have been, for the past 15 years, looking at it, how can we foster values and principles through education, not in a way that is inculcating not in a way that is transmitting, but rather nurturing, cultivating values. So how can we cultivate, not impose? How can we cultivate, not impose, or inculcate the ethics and values of sustainability, ecological literacy, global citizenship through education? And try to help learners align their actions with their decisions, align their actions and decisions with their words, with their values and thoughts, to be coherent. I'm about to end here. This is the result of a 10-year research we did to identify keys or pedagogical elements that could help us foster values of underlining values of sustainability and global citizenship through education in a transformative manner. So we identified 7 pedagogical elements that we need to foster values from kindergarten to higher education, universities, or lifelong learning too, using these elements of dialogue, question, the pedagogy of inquiry, using, I would just maybe mention here, arts and storytelling. And there's a lot behind each one of these circles here, the 7 elements. I would just mention 2, maybe. Human connection. Okay, when I was 8 years old, I don't remember well in which grade I was, maybe 2nd grade. I came to the school where I was very sad in that day. My parents were getting divorced. So I remember vividly that I came to my classroom sad. And my teacher, Elizabeth, her name, she perceived what was happening, that Miriam of 8 years old. She stopped what she was doing. She probably stopped a little bit her plan. And she took me in her arms and hugged me. So that's all I remember from my 8-year-old experience in my primary school. So the human-to-human connection. If I didn't have that hug from my teacher, maybe my story would be different in that year in the school. But all of us, if we are able to connect the human-to-human connection before the content. The issue here is that we, the teachers, we are so in love with our content, with what we need to bring to the head of the students, right? But before the content, we need to think of this human-to-human connection, right? So this is just to give you an illustration of what it is. And another illustration here on the arts and storytelling as instruments to foster values of sustainability. When I came across this work, I thought that values and ethics is really about philosophy. And it's about talking from a very abstract manner, you know, the abstract Socrates, Aristotle, or Plato, or learning what these philosophers would say. And there is a perception in many of our minds that the field of ethics and values is in the world of philosophy. The field of ethics and values could be even in the world of theology. But I have learned in the last 20 years that it's actually not. The field of ethics and values should be everywhere, on the streets, in our conversations, talking, questioning, clarifying, why do I do what I do? What's the consequences of my decisions? And trying to look at the tensions of our values and etc. So the use of arts and storytelling as a key instrument to foster values, we have seen that it can be really transformative if we make the use of storytelling and arts. And there is a lot of research being done on this particular one. Let me just finish here with this maybe idea of whole institutional approach. All of you are familiar with that, right? Whole institution. Can I see if you are familiar with the concept of whole institution approach of ESD? Yeah. Okay, so this what I'm showing here comes from a UNESCO document. It's a UNESCO document on ESD. It's called ESD for 2030. You can just Google that and find it. They identify a number of thematic areas. So one of them, and I'm just going to stop here to emphasize whole institution approach, because it's very... So what does it mean? If I'm in a school or if I'm in a university, if I want to bring in the notion of ESD in the whole institution approach, with a whole institution approach, I have to think about the curriculum, the different dimensions of the school, the curriculum, the pedagogy, the operations. So the curriculum is, what do I teach in that school? What do I teach in that university? And how can I incorporate, cross-cutting through the curriculum, the values and ideas of sustainability? The pedagogy is the how. How do I do that? So there's a lot of learning or understanding on more experiential approach and an interdisciplinary approach. So it's the how. The operation is that I cannot teach sustainability in my school or in my university if I'm not reflecting that in the way in which I'm operating, water management, energy management, etc. The physical space, this is actually a good example. This building, the whole building, this classroom, open space, natural air. So not all schools in the world have been built with those lenses. Actually, many schools don't have natural light, don't have fresh air. But the idea is to foster this aspiration to reflect the ideas of sustainability into that. And the relationship between the school and the community. I think from what little bit that I learned from RCE here in Tongyang in the schools is that the school is not only working within the sphere or the borders of the school, but the school or university is also building bridges with the community. So the idea of whole institution approach is really looking at incorporating the notion of ESD, not just as a topic, some people call it as a band-aid, but more looking at the DNA, in the DNA of the school, all the dimensions of the schools, to look at how can we transform the institutional culture or ethos to reflect the values and ideas of sustainability. All of this, of course, requires collaboration. Let me just maybe also mention this to you. I have been looking at a lot of these UNESCO education agendas for 20 years, or even more. But I have seen also the huge gap between international education policies, what happens at the national education agendas, and then what really happens in the classroom. How can we shrink or address this gap of what the teachers really need to do in the classroom and all this? So I feel like we need to trim a lot these various education agendas, and rather than looking at them in a fragmented manner, because it will be very complicated when we bring them to the classroom, but see how they are aligned, the commonalities, to make it easier for the schools. So the teachers, the educators, are really the foundation and the driving forces to make it happen in the classroom. So the teachers are the ones who need to be prepared. We need professional development for teachers all around, consistently, constantly, all everywhere, for the teachers to be able, pre-service teachers, so the ones who are studying to become teachers, but also in-service teachers, those who are already being a teacher, who have never heard necessarily on ESD or global citizenship, and they are still teaching all courses. And here we need to go beyond the thinking that ESD is only for science teachers. No, ESD is for language teachers. ESD is for history or social studies, and etc. Okay, for UNESCO, looking at the competences, the knowledge, skills, and values that we talked about need to be clarified. strengthening the idea of whole institution approach. But when it gets to higher education, parents and learners really want to go through the university. And then ESD, Global Citizenship Ed, becomes really a luxury until we can figure out a way to embed it in the assessments. For instance, in Brazil, in order to finish the secondary education, we need to pass a national exam. If in the national exam to write the essay we need to write, if we have to write about our understanding of sustainability, then the learner will quickly become an expert, you know, when they are 17-year-old, in order to pass the national exam to go to a university, to show their knowledge on system thinking, the limits of Earth, regenerative capacity of Earth. These are all sustainability basic knowledge, right? So if we could eventually transform the way in which we assess students' knowledge, it could make a major difference, I would say, in really expanding the scope and the reach of making ESD and global citizenship happen. Okay. At the beginning, I mentioned to you that we have a UNESCO chair, and we work at in that intersection of bringing the values of sustainability into education. I'll just quickly show you two things here we have. We work a lot with professional development for educators. We have been collaborating with George Washington University precisely in a course that looks at the linkages between ESD and global citizenship ed. So we're very focused on capacity building for educators and capacity building for young people to really understand what it means to be an ethical leader that have embedded or embraced the idea of sustainability. We develop resources that you can look at, you can make use of it. For instance, in a podcast, we have 60, I think, interviews on what sustainability is, a lot on new approaches of education. Most of them are in English, some are in Spanish. It's called the Earth Charter Podcast. We have a number of webinars and short courses, dialogues. Actually, an Earth Charter magazine, you can also have free access to it. Many of them actually articles of educators that are sharing how they're implementing ESD in schools. One of our commitments is to give visibility and elevate the voice of teachers, educators, schools. And we use the podcast, the webinars, our magazines to share experiences on ESD with the Earth Charter in general. This is a project we have with universities. By the way, for those of you from universities, this is a project we have with the Erasmus project with 14 universities on enhancing the capacity of teachers to bring ESD through the SDGs into universities. Many resources we have. For instance, the guide for using the Earth Charter in education, we launched at the UNESCO conference in Bonn in 2009. I think 2009, UNESCO organized the mid-term conference on ESD during the decade, and we launched this guide there. So these are basically like teacher's guide for how to bring sustainability into the classroom using the Earth Charter as an instrument. These are all free access. You can find it in our website. Actually, it's in many languages. We have also been helping UNESCO to put together some studies in Latin America on the implementation of ESD in schools. And some of these publications basically bring those together. These are basically examples of research and publications we have been working. Okay, let me end with this. Many years ago, a school in the UK came to us and said, we are the first Earth Charter school in the UK. And we said, that this was like 15 years ago, because we are using the Earth Charter, and we are now declared ourselves the first Earth Charter school. This was 15 years ago, and then of course we looked at there's no criteria, so there became a whole PhD research of someone who works with us. There was a project with Brighton University on how to develop indicators of values-based education. So this started 15 years ago, and the result of that is this. We developed a Earth Charter and ESD school seal, which has this whole research to identify indicators and a process to make it happen. And we have a few schools in Europe and in Latin America, and a few that are undergoing now in the US, that are taking this as a tool, again, a tool to self-assess how much the school is promoting the values of sustainability through a whole institution approach. So that's basically what this is, but through a common system, right? So it's basically a tool to support schools to enhance their capacity to incorporate ESD through the lenses of values and whole institution approach. It's quite interesting, and I invite you to take a look at it. It's in our website as an instrument. These are the levels, so level 1, 2, 3, so beginner, advanced, you know, how much the school is doing. Similar to the LEED certification for building. I don't know if you have seen it. It's a way to communicate. Okay, I end here with this question that is often in my mind. What can happen with our lack of consciousness when we go around the world making decisions without a sustainability lens? What can happen if we have a ethical, ecological, and systems literacy? The difference of that. So it's in our efforts as educators, as policymakers, to figure out ways, depending on where we are, in a school, in a policy level, at the national level, to really align the work we do to foster more caring, conscious, responsible global citizens. Not just someone who has knowledge, but without the heart and this lens of ethical, ecological, and system literacy. So thank you so much for listening. I will leave here maybe the website if you want more information, and have one second. I want to show, okay, maybe I can say this before I move to the website. Conditions. I have a 20-year-old daughter who is studying to become a biomedical engineer. She loves to do that. And then she used to dance ballet for all her life. And a year ago, she said, no, I'm stopping ballet and I'm going to be running. So she's jogging. And she thought that she could just go and run 10 kilometers very easily. It was a whole process to understand, as an athlete, what are the conditions for the athlete to really perform well. You need to eat well, sleep well. Good. Who said sleep well? Yeah. If you don't sleep well, there's no way you have the right conditions, no, to perform well. What else? You need to eat well, sleep well. Practice. Practice, practice, practice. But it's not just practice. You need something. You need knowledge and skills. That knowledge is the principle. So for instance, if I'm playing ping pong has a specific movement, right? If I'm doing cycling and I want to be a cycler, I cannot do cycling with my knees outside. It's not good, right? If I'm swimming, there's a specific way in which my arm needs to move. See, these are principles. Principles for the sports to perform well. And it's not just like, okay, now I know how to move my arm and that's it. No, you have to practice. Principles, practice, right? A lot of practice, a lot of principles, So these are the knowledge. So that the athlete has the condition. So there are a lot of conditions that need to be in place so that you can go and run a 10-kilometer, right? Sleep well, eat well, practice the principles of how to move, right? Huh? Playing well, plan. We need to plan well so that, she, in case of my daughter, she practiced well. She had the principles of how to move the body for running, but she didn't eat well and didn't sleep well. So she really failed, in the day she wanted to run. So conditions need to be in place. When we talk about sustainability, really incorporating sustainability, we need to have the principles and to practice, and the principles in place and be coherent with that. And it's not like from one day to another. It's an ongoing process. Clarification of values, an ongoing process of examining our decisions, an ongoing process to expand our vision. So again, what are the learner, the teacher, and the school condition to really excel in ESD? It involves many things, but it's important for us to have in mind that we need to have a number of things to align so that the school have the conditions. Good leadership. Teachers well prepared. Capacity building for teachers. The leadership, the teachers, and the learners with the open heart to learn. So I think the challenge is in our hand. I think we live in interesting times, very interesting times. We have all the UNESCO policies. The UN policies are there. So I invite you to envision like a wave, that you're surfing on the wave, because the UN agendas are there. They're very well, relatively well done, prepared. They pave the way. So, but schools and the national education system needs just to take that wave and make it happen in each of our own spheres of work. So thank you so much.